So, we're presently walking through Oakgrove, which is a new housing development in Milton Keynes. It's just about completed. The landscape is already starting to develop nicely with a range of native trees, slowly changing colour in the autumn as the chlorophyll is drawn back by the trees for storage and energy for next year. The leaves are turning lovely russet and brown. Through the middle of Oakgrove there is a feature called a SUDS feature, which is a sustainable urban drainage, and this was created at the beginning of the housing estate, and it helps to deal with flooding issues, which here in September in Milton Keynes, with unprecedented rainfall, we're suffering a little bit from flooding. But the SUDS feature, even though it was only created a few years ago, probably 5 years ago at the most, is already naturalised, and part of its creation was to provide a habitat for great crested newts, which have already moved into the space. Now, coming down into the linear park, which is managed by the Parks Trust, and the linear parks are a big feature of Milton Keynes, and they connect up housing estates, business estates with wildlife corridors. They generally follow the water bodies, and this particular one follows the River Ousel. And as I mentioned, we've had rather quite a lot of rain, and presently the linear park is a slowly moving lake. But underneath the water there's the footpaths that were created as part of the development, and submerged beneath those is a whole series of ponds which were also created as attenuation and also a habitat for great crested newts. And having surveyed these in the past, if you was to come down here in April, you would see an amphibian orgy if you turned up at the right time of night. The Ousel itself rises in the Chiltern Hills near Dunstable and travels down through Milton Keynes. It goes through and past some of the large attenuation lakes, and then eventually joins the River Ouse at Newport Pagnell. And the term Ouse, I believe, is a Saxon term and actually means river. So the Ouse river is river, and Ousel, I guess, is just a small river. Now, along the banks of this expanded river are lots of trees that were planted by the Development Corporation, the people who first set out Milton Keynes with this idea of the linear parks and to create this landscape that we now see, although be it very watery. There's a huge amount of poplar trees, which are a member of the Salix family, along with willows, and they very much like the wet conditions and grow very well, so they're enjoying this. And previously in the past, these trees, in ancient times at least, or a few hundred years ago, would have been turned into all sorts of woodland products. And a little further up the river there is a plantation of cricket bat willows, which was managed by the Parks Trust for cricket bats. The poplar trees are very charismatic to the watery bodies, and in themselves harbour lots of other insects. It's very still today, and we can just hear a few crows in the sky. If it had been a warmer day, we would probably now seen kites flying above us, and if it was in the middle of the summer, we might be lucky enough to spot a kingfisher darting along the river. Looking out across the river here, I can see a very large willow on the far banks, and it's got the bracket fungus. So you may sometimes see that trees have fungus, or the fruiting body. This is the part that the fungus throws up, similar to mushrooms when it wants to multiply. So beneath the ground and inside trees, there's all sorts of other organisms, whether they're fungi or whether they're beetles and other insects living either in the leaves, on the leaves, underneath the bark. So even on a day-to-day like today, where there's little to see, there is a lot going on just beneath the skin. Poplar trees, for example, they are home to the Cecia, which is a clear-wing hornet moth, and that's a moth that tries to look like a hornet to save itself from being predated, and that drills into the bottom of the tree as part of its process of laying its larvae. And if you ever come across one, it almost looks like someone has attacked the bottom of the tree with a very small drill. and that's part of the life cycle of the clear-winged hornet moth. Its design obviously is to put predators off, but unfortunately, because there aren't that many hornets around and there can be such a profusion of the clear-winged hornets, that if a bird takes one, it's not put off obviously, and then actually that strategy is not nearly as good for its continued existence. So we're just walking past the edge of Oakgrove back onto the linear park, and here there's an interface between the naturalised willow scrub, the wetland areas, and some of the planted species from the development which are naturalistic. And in front of me there is a rose, Guelder rose, and on the Guelder rose are these amazing russety red protrusions, and these are called by various names, but Robin's pincushion is one of them, and they're an example of galls. Now, galls come in all shapes and sizes, and you can find them on all sorts of trees as well as shrubs, and they're the result of very small insects, flies generally, and they interact with the plant and cause it to throw up these odd features. Some of the galls are small and round, typical oak galls, but the Robin's pincushions are really quite exceptional. But the story of them is even more convoluted in the fact that the fly that creates this first process does so, and the gall is to incubate its grubs, but in that process other flies will join in, and then some of those become parasitic on the grubs in it, and even some of the things that are parasitic on the things that are inside it also suffer from their own parasites. So fantastically convoluted process of evolution as different creatures over time take the opportunity to co-evolve with their fellows, but to us it just makes a very interesting and beautiful feature to nature at this time of year. So we're just standing near to the new BMX track just in the Linear Valley. We've had to cut through some severe undergrowth to get round here because of the flooding, and we're standing next to an oak tree which is probably 200 years old, and we'll probably find older ones still, and this is part of the original hedgerow. We can see it on the 1880s map, and this hedgerow was maintained as part of the development of Milton Keynes. This is something the Development Corporation did over large areas of Milton Keynes. They really looked into the history of the site, so there are books about different areas like the Wallstones and the Shenleys, all about the history of these sites. And just across the linear park here is Wallstone Church, which is probably around 1,000 years old. And the hedgerows, although it's difficult to say their exact age, are certainly hundreds of years old and potentially much older than that. And the corporation ensured that they were retained to create a sense of place, and that there'll be a sense of maturity to that place. And this was combined with literally millions of trees that were planted across the city, which are now quite substantial, 40 plus years of age. And we're standing next to the Redway, and this is one of the linking paths through the linear park and joins up to other areas. A few hundred yards further up the linear park there's a public right-of-way, it's a bridleway, and people perhaps think of those mostly being in rural areas, but they were again retained throughout the city, and they hark back to a much earlier day when people would have probably walked from the village of Broughton across to Wallstone. And when the Rights of Way Act came in, these were mapped and recorded, and if you've got a horse and you live in Wallstone, you can still ride it to Broughton today legally along the bridleway. Down in the linear park, as I say, many of the features were created as well as the ones retained. We're looking across the grassland, which has been purposely left long by the Parks Trust, who are the guardians of a lot of the linear parks and lots of other open spaces in Milton Keynes. And they do a fantastic job to enhance the wildlife, and by letting the grass grow longer, it's great for the insects. And we can now see in early autumn, all the seed heads that are on the grasses and various plants that will provide food throughout the winter, along with the hedgerow plants, the rowans and the sloes, hawthorn berries. And just near to where we're standing we can see a barn owl box, and barn owls are almost ubiquitous with human occupation. The name barn probably gives that away, but because we've got so few barns now, we actually have to create places for the barn owls. They would have probably traditionally, well, in the past, before humans' occupations and barns, they would have lived in big old trees, but again, there's very few of those today. So this gives the barn owl a fantastic place to stay, and the landscape here is fantastic for barn owls to go hunting. The long grass is fantastic for small mammals, the seeds, and gives it cover, so at least they have a fair run to try and avoid the ghost of the barn owl flying over the linear park. Now, some of those big old trees, which unfortunately we don't have too many in Milton Keynes but are looking to reintroduce them, are the black poplars. There's a nationally scarce tree, and although we have poplars here in the park, they're hybrid poplars, and so they have much better vigour, but they don't have that local provenance of the black poplar. And with pressure on native trees through various diseases, then maybe bringing that back, the black poplar, would benefit particularly areas that are wet, such as this. They are a magnificent tree, they grow huge. If you're familiar with the Hayne Wain by Constable, the big tree in that is a black poplar. So we're now standing further down the linear park, and standing in front of the historical hedge, which, because it's not been managed in its traditional way, it's lost its use really. You know, the reason for hedges is, well, probably first of all to demarcate ownership, and so the first hedges were probably in fact dead hedges, where they cleared areas of woodland and just piled up brash to say this is mine, or to keep their animals and stock in. Obviously that would be going back thousands of years. And then hedges evolved in all sorts of different styles all over the country, and the traditional management style in this area would be called midlands, where the trees are allowed to grow up to probably 3 or 4 metres, and then there's a pleach, which is effectively a cut down the stem at the lower end that allows the trees to be bent over, and they're bent over at an angle. And with the midlands style, posts are then driven in, which would probably have been hazel, and across the top will be a binding, maybe of hazel or willow or another pliable species, just to hold the whole structure in place. And then the hedge would have regrown, and the idea of putting all that extra structure in was to prevent your cattle moving through it until it got nicely established. And by cutting it and laying it in that manner, the tree would then sprout up along the stems and develop. Often where traditional hedges have perhaps relapsed, as this has, it's now more of a linear woodland, but you can see the huge variety of species. We're standing next to an alder, but that's actually part of the planting. But in front of us is an ash tree, there's hawthorns, blackthorns, there's a hazel in there, and then lower down we've got a bramble thicket now, with the blackberries just coming to the end of their season. Rose, and the rose hips shining bright. You could just hear the clatter of the birds taking off, not quite sure what that one was. And we're standing underneath here an elder. All the leaves have come from the elder now, but fantastic tree, providing the berries in the autumn, the wonderful flowers to make elder flower cordials. Very much a sacred tree in, you know, pagan past, but the one we're looking at now is completely covered in different types of lichen, greys and greens, and on top of the lichen is growing mosses. And this microclimate here is very damp, very moist, and the air obviously is of a fairly good quality, and the tree, whilst looking perhaps a bit decrepit in some respects, is demonstrating all the life that trees hold upon them. Ted Green, a great expert in ancient trees, has said that if you almost took away all the thing that the tree is, you would leave a silhouette of all the creatures and plants that live upon it. Next to us, we've got the dried out stem of a cow parsley, its umbellifera flowers at the top, and just beneath it and on the stem are 3 snails. What they're doing there, I don't know, but they have the most gorgeous colour to their shells, to rival anything that you could see in a coral reef if you just but look hard enough. Thinking about times past and times present, just up the road in Olney, which is just off the Ouse, there's a famous poet of the 1700s, a gentleman called Cowper, although I've now discovered you have to pronounce it as Cooper. And I'll read one of his poems. Obviously it is of his time, but hopefully it might give you a feel of these riparian areas and how people felt about them. This is the Poplar Field, 1784. The poplars are felled, farewell to the shade, and the whispering sound of the cool colonnade. The winds play no longer and sing in the leaves, nor ooze on his bosom their image receives. 12 years have elapsed since I last took a view of my favourite field and the bank where they grew, and now in the grass behold they are laid, and the tree is my seat that once lent me shade. The blackbird has fled to another retreat, where the hazels afford him a screen from the heat, and the scene where his melody charmed me before resounds with his sweet flowing ditty no more. My fugitive years are all hasting away, and I must ere long lie as lowly as they, with a turf on my breast and a stone at my head, another such grove shall rise in its stead. 'Tis a sight to engage me, if anything can, to muse on the perishing pleasure of man. Through his life be a dream, his joyment I see, have a being less durable even than me. And it harks back to a long tradition of poetry about nature, long before we had other things to distract us, and the musings of the landscape that we live in and how that landscape changes. Milton Keynes, it's changed massively over the last 50 or 60 years, but landscapes change from day and night, they change through the seasons, and they change even by the hour with the weather that they bring. And for you and me, that's not much of a problem. We can put on a hat or a pair of wellies or a thicker coat. But for the wildlife and nature, they must adapt and live in these spaces and live through all these times. With small birds like wrens having to feed every day just to get to the next day. It's a struggle, and anything we can do to help nature will help us. It's been shown that being near trees and wildlife brings great pleasure and relaxation, something we should treasure.